Here. Well, welcome everyone. I am Andy Weibel, and welcome to the winter, and it feels like winter here today, the winter lecture series of the Heritage Museum and Cultural Center. I'm on the board here at the Heritage Museum. When I say here, I'm actually in my home, but so I'm excited to learn a little bit more about Fort St. Joe tonight from Michael Nassaney. His information is up there, but I do want to say a few words about him. And before I do so, I assume you're talking, Michael, for what, hour, 45 minutes, or?
You told me I had 3 hours tonight.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, okay, I can keep it to about 50 minutes and then time for some questions?
Yeah, then we'll have questions. And
okay.
People can do questions either through the chat feature, or feel free just to speak up and unmute yourself. And so let me say a little bit about Dr. Nassaney. Let me see here how I do that. Here we go. I think I got to do it that way. All right. So Dr. Michael Nassaney is a professor emeritus. We just found out recently, as of September, in the Department of Anthropology at Western Michigan University, and the principal investigator of the Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project. Nassaney has directed the annual Western Michigan University Archaeological Field School since 1994, and his research interests include historical archaeology, the study of colonialism, and the fur trade in the Western Great Lakes. He is the author of The Archaeology of the North American Fur Trade, co-editor of the Interpretations of North American Life, Material Contributions to Ethnohistory, and he's the author of Fort St. Joseph Revealed, Historical Archaeology of a Fur Trading Post, which we'll be hearing about today. In 2013, he was appointed by the governor of Michigan to serve on the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission. For the past decade, he has been working to develop an anti-racist identity to inform how he lives in the world. And in 2015, he received the Western Michigan University Distinguished Teaching Award, the highest honor given by the university to recognize faculty members for work with their students. And so now, without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Michael Nassaney and our final lecture of the winter series, How to Find a Lost French Fort and What to Do with It Once You Do.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to the Heritage Museum and Cultural Center. I have spoken in person at your beautiful facility there in St. Joe on a number of occasions, and I hope to be able to do so again soon. And in the meantime, this will have to do. So let me tell you a little bit about what I want to tell you about tonight. And these are some of the talking points. So some of you might not be familiar with Fort St. Joseph, so I want to give you a little brief history of the fort, where it was established, when it was established, why it was established, and some of the activities that took place there and what we knew about it before we started doing archaeology. And then I want to tell you a little bit about the Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project. This is a partnership between Western Michigan University and the city of Niles that began in the late 90s, early 2000s. It's really been the umbrella under which all the historical and archaeological investigations have been conducted. So some 20 years of work, we've revealed a good bit about Fort St. Joseph, and I want to share with you a little bit about what we've learned with about some 15 seasons of field investigations involving just scores, if not hundreds of students, novice archaeologists and student archaeologists and graduates and colleagues in various departments and so forth. And in fact, as we mentioned, that's the title of the most recent book, Fort St. Joseph Revealed, which provides more detail on a lot of that. And I also want to tell you about how we've been doing this work. Even though I get to talk about it and others get to talk about it, I'm just one of many, right? So we've developed a number of very, very important partnerships that allow us to engage in various types of public outreach, where we disseminate information to a wider community, a wider general audience, like this talk, but there's DVDs and websites and social media, and the list goes on. And I'll tell you a little bit about that and how you can learn more about our project. And I want to tell you about some ongoing work that we're involved in as well. Even though we've managed to discover the fort and we've been investigating it, we anticipate that there's decades and decades more work that can take place at the site. So first off, some of you may recognize this map. It's maybe a somewhat peculiar map of part of North America, but you can probably recognize here in the upper right-hand corner, here's Lake Michigan, and sort of the outline of the lower peninsula, the mitten here. But it's sort of, I use it to illustrate the point of why were the French even in Michigan? Why were they in North America? Well, eventually it was for furs, and it was to develop alliances with native peoples and so on. But really, North America was just an impediment to their larger imperial plans. They were hoping to actually find a way to get to China. They were looking for a Northwest Passage. And they were on this search for as early as Jacques Cartier in the 1530s, who sailed up the mouth of the St. Lawrence River and continued on that quest for at least 200 years. So you can see in this map here, as recently as 1752, French map makers were constructing North America with a huge western sea, right? Mer de l'Ouest, which is actually located somewhere where about Montana is today. But they reasoned that somewhere, right, just beyond maybe the Great Lakes, just beyond the headwaters of the Mississippi, there had to be a body of water that would get them across this continent that ultimately would lead them to Asia. Well, of course, there was the Pacific Ocean, but that was still hundreds of miles off. They hadn't made that trek. And in the course of their search, they established some 106 trading posts from the eastern edge of the Great Lakes in it'd be sort of western New York, as far west as central Canada. Right, so these posts were in the Illinois country. They were down the Mississippi River Valley. They were throughout the Great Lakes. They were in the upper reaches of the Mississippi, and even points further west. And these posts were established to obtain furs, which proved to be quite valuable to the French. And it allowed them to maintain alliances, to create relationships with native groups who were important to them. Because frankly, there just weren't that many French in North America, and they were vying for control of the continent, right, with their arch rivals. Well, the Spanish, but maybe more to the point here, was actually the English. So the English, as you know, had secured the eastern seaboard, and they were attempting to move west, right, eventually across the Appalachians, into the Ohio Valley, right, and to continue to expand. And this is ultimately what led to the French and Indian War. The French attempting to contain the English, which ultimately failed. And so places like Fort St. Joseph, which were strategic French settlements right on into the 1760s, eventually came onto British hands. So let me focus in now on this region with sort of a more modern map that you probably will recognize. And it just shows you a handful of some of these French settlements, right, at the Straits of Mackinac, right? And few of you from at least Michigan don't know about Fort Michilimackinac, right? A very important trading post at the very strategic Straits of Mackinac. Fort LaBay at Green Bay, and Pontchartrain, which is now where Detroit is. And of course, the activity a little closer to home here, right in your backyard, those of you who are in St. Joe right now, would be Fort Miami at the mouth of the St. Joseph River. And then, of course, Fort St. Joseph in Niles. So, as many of you know, LaSalle was really the region's first fur trader, right? He established Fort Miami somewhere at the mouth of the St. Joseph River. We don't know exactly, but there is this very handsome granite marker, commemorative marker, established in, commemorated, dedicated in 1902. And of course, the state historical marker as well in fairly close proximity. And each of those, the monument and the marker, are probably close to where the fort was. We did a little bit of research in this area when they were putting some utility lines in along the bluff there. And we didn't really, and we did some subsurface testing as well. We didn't really find any evidence of Fort Miami, but our background research suggested to us that when the Whitcomb Hotel was being expanded sometime in the 1920s, some burned upright posts were found. And that in fact seems consistent with Fort Miami. So Fort Miami was short-lived. There is no known archaeological evidence of it. And so at this point, it can't teach us much. So that was somewhere over here at the mouth of the river. Well, shortly thereafter, when the French come back to the area, if you will, they had some familiarity with the area. They decide to establish their settlement further upriver at a place called, which they ultimately, well, at the time it was known as the River of the Miamis. And this was the settlement was known as the Post of the Miamis. And not only was it on this very strategic waterway, the St. Joseph River, which, as you can see in this map, immediately south of Fort St. Joseph, there is a short portage. It's not shown. There is actually a trail shown here. But more to the point is the upper reaches of the Kankakee River. So the portage connected the St. Joseph River to the Kankakee. And those of you who know that geography know that the Kankakee leads to the Illinois, which leads to the Mississippi. This is all a long way of saying that from New Orleans to Quebec, or actually really from Quebec to New Orleans, there's a continuous water route that's separated by about 5 miles of portage just at Fort St. Joseph. And of course, it was also along what became the old Sauk Trail. So this too was a strategic location, and it was selected for that reason. First as the site of a mission in the 1680s, and then in 1691, established the location of not only the mission, but expanded to a small garrison of about 10 to 12 soldiers, and an important commercial center where as many as 15 fur traders, they're French Canadian, they're French, their native wives, their children, along with a blacksmith, an interpreter, a commandant, and several others, making a population of about 50 to 60 people who occupied that location for almost 100 years. So this is a very detailed map that was drawn by Thomas Hutchins. I sometimes say he was an English spy. So after the capitulation of New France to the British controlled Fort St. Joseph, and they sent men like Hutchins out to determine what the military might of these native allies, Allied populations were. So you can see not only does he mark Fort St. Joseph on this map, but he also indicates that there were 200 Potawatomi men. So why was he only paying attention to men? Well, these were men who could wield weapons, right? So it wasn't old guys like me or youngsters or women or children. But if you add those people up, you sort of multiply the number of men probably by 5, then we know there was a population of about 1,000 native peoples immediately across the river from Fort St. Joseph in 1762 upon his visit. So what we know about the site, we know through some documentary sources like these maps I just alluded to. There is a baptismal and a marriage record that was kept by the Jesuit priests. There's correspondences between the commandant and his superiors in Detroit, in Michilimackinac, as well as in Quebec and ultimately to France. And despite all of this documentary record, there's lots we don't know about Fort St. Joseph. For example, we didn't even know exactly where the fort was on the ground. We have no detailed descriptions of the site. There are no detailed drawings. And so essentially there's so much that we can learn from archaeology about day-to-day life and just what this place actually looked like. So the site has been of interest for some time. And in fact, it was occupied, I mentioned, into the English period until 1763, when the Anglo-Native War that involved Pontiac led to the takeover of the fort, and the British soldiers were marched out of there. Several of them were killed. The site continued to be occupied by French fur traders until 1781, on that auspicious day when a group of French and natives under the Spanish flag from St. Louis came to Fort St. Joseph and claimed Michigan for Spain. So Niles is known as the city of Four Flags, sometimes Fort St. Joseph, the Four Flags Fort. This is the only place in Michigan that waved not only the American, French, and English, but also the Spanish flag. So it was abandoned about 1781. Some French were deported at that point by the English to Michilimackinac, and the site was no longer occupied. Some of the timbers might have been used for other settlements in the area. But as early as around the late 19th century, local avocational historians, including then president of the Historical Society of Michigan, Louis Beeson, who lived right up the road, actually started collecting artifacts from the surface of the site. And that's what we can see here. We see he and his band, known as the Miami Cross Society, walking across this field, picking up artifacts probably associated with Fort St. Joseph. The site was commemorated in 1913 to great fanfare. This huge boulder, maybe weighing as much as 65 to 70 tons, was brought to the location. There were parades, there were speeches, there were songs, and the place was commemorated as the site of Fort St. Joseph. Of course, at the time, the site was probably a little bit closer to the river, but this seemed to be a good place to put the rock since it was visible from the road. So from about that time when Beeson and his colleagues were collecting artifacts until really the 1990s, it wasn't entirely clear where Fort St. Joseph was. The situation became complicated because the dam on the St. Joseph River was increased in height, creating a flood pool that partially flooded the site. And that area then became the site of a local landfill. So some of this 20th century landfill covered the site. Some of the site might have been washed away by the river. It was clearly a serious dilemma. It was a puzzle. It was just uncertain where the site was and if it ever would be found. And we were invited by a group called Support the Fort and the City of Niles to come and help them find the fort. We dug a number of shovel test pits, and sure enough, we eventually found evidence and were able to demonstrate that, in fact, Fort St. Joseph had been found. And we published that in Michigan History Magazine in 2002. So archaeologists are not just interested in objects. See, because as it turns out, Beeson and the Miami Cross Society had found lots of objects, but they really weren't practicing the science of archaeology. They weren't paying attention to where objects were from specifically and how they were related. So there were literally thousands upon thousands of artifacts that had been donated to the Fort St. Joseph Museum. Some were also in a museum in South Bend. Some made their way even to Kalamazoo. So we had lots and lots of artifacts from Fort St. Joseph. But what archaeologists are interested in is asking research questions, right? So they want to ask questions, and then they want to use the archaeological record to answer those questions, sort of like a laboratory, like a living laboratory. So the first thing we did was we created this partnership between WMU and the City of Niles. Let's see, probably the best way to put it was WMU had some archaeologists and they needed a site. And the City of Niles had an important site and they needed archaeologists. So it was a perfect marriage, if you will, a partnership between these two entities. And we continue to work together. And in fact, we just signed the third cooperative agreement that will take our partnership to the year 2027. So we've sort of phrased our research questions around the study of the fur trade and colonialism with the public in mind. Right? So we've been receptive to public input. At the very start, it was local peoples who told us why they're interested in the site, the kinds of information they wanted. They ultimately wanted some kind of a reconstruction. And so we've been working to collect architectural data because we didn't know where buildings were and how large buildings were and who occupied them and so forth. Because as I said, we didn't have maps that would provide that sort of information. The other thing, the study of the fur trade and colonialism is a way to understand a little bit more about the relationships between the French and the people who were already here, the native peoples, right? So what was that, the nature of that relationship? Was it amicable? Did it lead to conflict? What goods were exchanged between the groups and so on? How were goods used on a daily basis? Were they reinterpreted within various cultural contexts and so on? And this is what archaeology can tell us about, sort of the daily activities that took place at the site, right? The literal detritus of everyday life, the things that get broken, thrown away, and lost in the course of daily activities. So again, to sort of phrase one of these questions, the question is, what happened when the French encountered native peoples in the fur trade, right? What happened? And what can archaeology reveal about these interactions in daily life at the fort? Archaeology being the study of the materiality, the material remains of everyday life. Right, the bones of meals that people threw away and broken gun parts and pipe fragments and rusty nails and so forth. What can that tell us about these interactions and daily life at the fort? Well, let me shift gears a little bit and tell you how we do the work, how we involve the public, and then how we disseminate the results. Well, first off, central to this activity has been the WMU Archaeological Field School. So up until COVID, The WMU Archaeological Field School, established in 1976, was the longest running archaeological field school in the country. Some 44 years up through 2019. We weren't able to be in the field last year. But this is an opportunity for university students, not only from WMU, but from any university student in good standing throughout the US, to participate in a field program where they can learn how to do archaeology and disseminate the results to a wider audience. We also run a summer camp program, and I know some of you who are listening today have actually participated in the summer camp program. So this was established in 2002, and this is an opportunity for middle schoolers, high schoolers, and lifelong learners to actually do archaeology, working cheek by jowl with university students. It's been highly successful. We've trained over 300 novice archaeologists since the camp began in 2002. We hold a public lecture series, and this year it will be done virtually, but we focus on a different theme each year. So we have looked at, we bring in nationally and internationally known speakers who can talk about their work at related sites or related topics, and we focus on a theme each year. So we've looked at the fur trade, and we've looked at the Jesuits, and we've looked at the women of New France, and we've looked at community involvement, and we've looked at the St. Joseph River and all the activities associated with it as a focus of our studies. So each year there's changes, and each year we bring in different speakers who can talk about that. The culminating event of our fieldwork is usually the Archaeology Open House. And this is a great activity, usually in early August. We're trying to figure out how we can do something like this, because it would bring literally hundreds of people to the archaeological site where they could see the excavations, they could view displays of artifacts, they can engage with living history reenactors, and they can just learn more about archaeology and history of Fort St. Joseph for a weekend in early August. We have lots of volunteers and fort followers who participate in all sorts of ways. And we do public lectures like these. And as I said, I've been to St. Joe on several occasions. We've done displays. We did an artifact display at your institution there in St. Joe. We've had internships for students, and we produce DVDs. Some of these are available online through YouTube and so on. We have a publicly accessible booklet series, and we've produced over 100 publications for scholarly and general audiences. And let's take a look at this here. This shows you a little bit about what some of our students can do, I think, if I can pull this up.
Hi, everybody. I'm Reagan. I am the lab coordinator this year at Fort St. Joseph. Welcome to the floodplain. This is where we have the wet screening.
To see that, you need to read.
So all of the sediment that we pull out of our units, we take it down here.
Are you able to hear that?
Wet screen and look for all of the really small artifacts, tiny pieces of bone, glass, seed beads, or lead shot. Okay, so now I'm going to begin screening some sample soil from one of our units and see what we find. When we screen all of our dirt, we don't want to use it yet because we don't want to push any of the tiny artifacts through. We also want to make sure that we're screening it with the hose at a 90-degree angle. You don't want to get yourself wet, even though that is pretty inevitable. So here are some of the artifacts we found while screening. One of them is a small little seed bead. We find a lot of these here at Fort St. Joseph. This is a piece of calcined bone or cooked bone. You can tell that it's calcined by the white/blue color. And here we have a fully intact black bear first phalanx. Now that I've wet screened the majority of the artifacts out of here, I'll lay them all out on one of these nice cardboard flats to dry. And once they're dry, we'll bag it all up inside of an artifact bag with 2 tags so it can be taken back to our lab and further processed by the field school students. Thanks for stopping by the wet screens at Fort St. Joseph.
Okay. Okay, hope you were able to view that and hear that.
We couldn't view it, but we could hear it.
We are on the road with Miss Stephanie.
Oh,
And did you know that April
see.
is Stress Awareness Month?
sorry
So
about
we
that.
thought it would be a great idea to visit someone that could help us with these times when we are experiencing stress, especially our young people. And so in the children's room, we want to let you know.
Okay. Don't want any more stress. Okay. So here's the lay of the land. So those of you who are familiar with the area here, well, of course, the St. Joseph River, here's Bond Street. That commemorative boulder I showed you is right here. And when we began our investigations in 1998, we dug a series of small shovel test pits in the areas now that's identified as locus 1, 2, and 3. And we didn't find much in the way of 18th century artifacts there. We dug lots of small holes, about 350 of them, spread out about 10 meters apart. But it was down in the floodplain area between this landfill, right, this early 20th century landfill and the river, where we dug about 80 shovel test pits, and about a quarter of them had 18th century artifacts. So just sort of keep that in mind, because this is the area we've been focusing on, but this area is also important because we've returned there and we found that in fact, there are more artifacts in those locations. It's a different kind of activity, but there were people living and working there while there were also people living at the fort. So in that lower floodplain area, we have found huge stones like these. And also this orange, reddish, oxidized soil, right? So these are big fireplaces, right? So maybe on the order of about 6 feet in diameter, right? And this is really good evidence for the location of houses. So we've been able to identify the locations of several houses at Fort St. Joseph. And not only the fireplaces, but also foundation walls and upright posts. So, you know, who but an archaeologist can get excited about rocks and decayed wood, right? So here we see a row of stones. You might say, well, you know, why so interesting? Well, they don't occur that way in nature, right? These have been lined up by someone intentionally. Furthermore, they've been stacked on top of each other. And then you can see a white residue on some of these stones. That's actually mortar that was once holding these stones together. So this is part of a foundation wall. And here, and more clearly in this location, is the very exterior of the remains of a wooden post. We cored down in this with like a hollow coring tool. And we determined that this goes down about another 2.5 feet. So this is actually the corner of a building, a post that was anchoring a corner of a building. And this is what we think these buildings look like. So we have these foundation walls, these fireplaces. Here I'm looking in the lower left, and these are sort of the projected boundaries of these buildings. And this is what these buildings might have been look like, sort of an artist's reconstruction. So they weren't very large, maybe the size of like a small to medium sized bedroom, but that's what they were living in and spending most of their time probably outside, except in the really inclement weather. So in essence, what we're doing is we're creating the map of Fort St. Joseph. So what I'm showing you here, these red outlines, are extrapolating from the location of a fireplace here, a fireplace there, a fireplace there, and showing you the locations of what we think were several buildings in that floodplain area. So here we excavated at the very corner of this location, and sure enough, we found this ash. And then you can see this sort of turns at a right angle here, and there's lighter colored soil on the outside in here. So we think this is probably the corner of a building there. And so again, these are subtle. And in this location, We have found another jumble of stones with some oxidized soil. We're not quite sure how this is oriented, but we think that represents yet another building, right? And as it turns out, we've looked at the contents of these buildings, and based on the contents, we don't think they were occupied by soldiers or the priest, but it looks like these were probably occupied by fur traders and their families. So archaeology can also give us information on just very mundane activities, like things like what people were eating. Fort St. Joseph has yielded a remarkable assemblage of animal bones, some 50,000 animal bones, predominantly of wild species. So this is really interesting to us because, I mean, the French had domesticated animals for millennia, right? And they had been subsiding on wheat and other domesticated plants as well. And yet at Fort St. Joseph, they're eating predominantly wild animals, lots and lots and lots of deer, but we find the bones of beaver, raccoon, swan, geese, just a whole range of different animals. Somewhat surprisingly, not much in the way of fish, given the proximity of the St. Joseph River. We also find some plant foods, and you probably can recognize these, even if you're not an archaeologist, right? These are actually carbonized corn cobs. So here's our scale. This is 3 inches. So, you know, these are obviously broken, but maybe these were maybe 5 or 6 inches in length, so obviously smaller than the kind of hybridized corn we have today. This is what the Indians were growing at the time. But what's interesting is that these cobs are carbonized. So in other words, had these been burned when they were dry, they would have just turned to ash. But the fact that they're carbonized suggests that they were burned when they were green. And that would produce a very, very smoky fire. The other thing is the context of these finds. So we found many of those in small pits like these. And if you look carefully here, you can actually see some of these are individual cobs. There is charcoal in here too, but a good bit of the contents of this small pit, and this is maybe the size of about a soccer ball, I would say, okay? A little bit smaller than a basketball. And there's several of these pits, and these are actually found in Locust 2 on that high ground above the floodplain. So these are what we call smudge pits. We have examples of native peoples in historical times, in more recent times when they were being documented with photography even and written records of what they were doing with these pits. And you can see here that this little hole has been dug here on the left, and this wooden frame has been placed over it. And in the middle frame, this deer skin sewn on has been placed over this smoky fire that would have been built in that little pit, and it's shown here. So this is a way for smudging or smoking these hides so they would be soft and subtle, more like suede as opposed to leather. And this is a way of processing these hides and in fact increasing their value. We get a really good sense of the kinds of daily activities that were taking place at Fort St. Joseph. So these objects, for example, were found in front of one of the fireplaces. So here, part of a scissors, perhaps for cutting cloth, straight pins, this awl for piercing leather, and then these beads that probably were destined to be sewn onto a garment, except that the person who was working in front of this flickering fire maybe dropped 1 or 2 or more over a long period of time, was unable to recover them until they were found by the discerning eye of the archaeologist. So we know precisely what someone was doing in front of this fireplace. They were engaged in these kinds of activities. The objects in the museum that were collected randomly can't tell us about that kind of activity, but these objects found in context can. So many pins. Where are the needles? I'll let you ponder that for just a second. Any ideas in the chat? All right, well, there's going to be another riddle later too, so be prepared for it. I should have warned you. As it turns out, these straight pins were made of a copper alloy, brass, and they're pretty much resistant to degradation, to decay. The needles, we found only one or two. It looks like they were made of iron, so they tended to rust and not preserve in the archaeological record. So even though they show up in trading lists, don't seem to be able to find them in the archaeological record. Now we know cloth was a very important commodity, right? Some archaeologists have looked at trade lists to other sites in the Western Great Lakes region, and they have found that, yes, there are guns being traded, there's some alcohol that's being made available, there's some gunpowder and some face paint, vermilion, and so on. But by and large, by the sheer value and quantity of goods, cloth was most important, constituted upwards of 60 to 70% of the materials that were exchanged to native peoples. We don't find evidence of cloth because it doesn't preserve, but we did find this. This little lead seal here, seen on the right-hand side of the screen, is a little smaller than a quarter, maybe the size of a quarter. And this one is marked with some writing. It has a B with a fleur-de-lis here, and this says Forain de Lille. The B stands for bureau, or the office. The Bureau de Forain de Lille, or the Office of Inspection in the city of Lille in northwest France. Sorry, in northeast France. So we know that different production centers in France were making different kinds of cloth. So by finding seals like these that were attached to bolts of cloth that were shipped from Lille all the way to Fort St. Joseph, they can provide us information on the types of cloth that people were using at the site. So various goods were used pretty much as they were intended. So very handy items here are these kettles, right? They're very durable. You can drop them and they're not going to crack, and they might dent. I mean, eventually they'll wear out, but they could be used for cooking. They could be used for toting water. You make soup and gruels in them and so forth. Very, very useful items, very durable. But they would eventually wear out. And then what we see is that people would have essentially cannibalized them. They'd break them up and use the handles for awls, and they'd make projectile points out of them. They might use parts of them for scrapers or hair pipes. These are little tubular rolled copper that they would put in their hair. They'd make ornaments out of them. And they'd make these little tinkling cones, which are also a type of ornament. And I'll show you some examples of tinkling cones that were found at Fort St. Joseph. But first, let me show you some of this copper scrap, right? So you can see this has been cut out here, the middle top there. And then they'd sometimes make patches, and they made rivets out of them to attach the patches to try to repair these kettles and so on. So we find ample amounts of this, so we can see the kinds of activities that they're involved in. And here's what these tinkling cones look like. So these are little trapezoidal pieces of copper alloy that are rolled around a mandrel, a little cone-shaped, right, mandrel. And then these would have been attached to bags, clothing, moccasins, and you can see some of the leather still stuck in this one, right? And these would have been placed adjacent to each other, and they'd when the person moved on one's moccasin or clothing, they would bang up against each other and make a pleasant little tinkling sound. If you've ever been to a powwow, you've probably seen these on native garments and so on. So this is interesting because this is an imported raw material, but essentially it's a native concept. It's a native decorative style. Well, here's a riddle for you. When is a thimble not a thimble? Well, let me give you a minute to think about that. In the meantime, let me show you what we've got here. We know that when these furs are being collected at Fort St. Joseph, they needed to be shipped back to Quebec, Montreal, Quebec, and ultimately to France. They would often wrap them in canvas, and they would use these huge needles, right? So back to our scale here, 1, 2, 3 inches. This needle is about 6 inches long, right? So this is a needle used for stout canvas, right? And just above, you can see examples of a couple of thimbles that we recovered. Now, these would come in handy if you're trying to push this needle through that canvas, right? Most of us know what needles were used for. But when is a thimble not a thimble? Well, here's another thimble we found. Now, this is the same thimble, it's just 3 different angles that are shown on it. Now, you'll notice what's distinctive about this one is it has a hole in the top. You might say, well, perhaps it just wore out that way. Well, I examined this from the bottom, and it's clear that someone took a nail or some sharp object, and they punched a hole in this. Now, what kind of a thimble would that be? Right? It's not going to be very useful if it has a hole in the top. When is a thimble not a thimble? Well, when it's a tinkling cone. You can see examples of these thimbles here that were perforated and used on this garment. And they would bang up against each other and make a little pleasing tinkling sound. So a thimble is not a thimble when it's a tinkling cone. And here's some examples of that garment. The close up here. And here's that garment in the Royal Ontario Museum. The point is that this was recovered from that terrace where those smudge pits were probably natives, maybe native wives of French traders are smudging these hides, and where there was some kind of a native presence. When a native person saw this thimble, he or she did not think thimble. They thought, this would be a perfect tinkling cone. So what archaeology provides us with is insight as to how these goods were actually used. Not just how they were intended to be used, but how they were actually used. So these buttons on the left are from a French Marine uniform. We didn't find very many of them, and that suggests probably the military were not occupying the area we're working at. This is an interesting specimen here on the top right. It's the butt plate of a flintlock musket. When we first recovered this, we noticed there's a bow and a quiver filled with arrows etched on this part of the butt plate. That's not uncommon. That's appeared elsewhere. But what was unusual on this particular specimen was along the margins here, and there's a close-up below, there were a series of little marks or scratches. That was a bit peculiar. We looked at it closely and we noticed, they actually look like they're file marks. And then we looked closer again and we noticed that they were in groups of 10. So there's 119 marks all along the margins of this. Somebody was counting something. Use your imagination for what they were counting. So there are objects that not only relate to everyday life or even just hunting and working and living and building structures, but even recreation and grooming. I mean, these are all fragments of smoking pipes. These are stone, these are clay, and these are found amongst each other. So it looks like French and their native allies were using both stone and clay smoking implements. This is a mouth harp. There would have been a little tongue, a metal piece that ran off here, and you'd hold this over your mouth and sort of twang that little metal piece there, and you can make some pleasing music with that. These are some interesting specimens here. I'll get to those in a minute. Here on the bottom right, you probably recognize this. All the teeth are broken off, but this is a comb. And you can see these teeth are larger than these teeth. And you can probably find something like that in Walmart today, I would think. Let's go back for a minute here. So here, we've got these two dish-shaped objects. And this one has a couple incised lines. It has some red pigment in it. This one has several radiating lines, a series of dots. Kind of looks like a domino or a die of some sort. The other side is very, very smooth. And we think that these are gaming pieces, right, that were used in a game, a dice game played by Potawatomi women, where they would place these objects in this case, in this bowl. They would bounce the bowl up and down, and they would predict or count the number of heads and tails. And so these objects would lend themselves to a game of chance. I think these objects look remarkably similar to these. They're not exactly the same, but you can see there's a lot of variation in these gaming pieces as well. And people wanted to look good on the frontier. They wanted their garments to be embroidered. They wore finger rings. They wore buckles and so on. And they went to great lengths to obtain these little shell beads here that made their way all the way from the Atlantic seaboard. These shell beads known to us as wampum. I mentioned to you that there was a priest at Fort St. Joseph, and many of the denizens of the fort were in fact religious. And some native peoples were converted to Christianity as well, to Catholicism, though not all. These two specimens on the top are specimens we have found at the fort. And this specimen, this round specimen here was reproduced, so you can see a better view of it here, both obverse and reverse. So here's the Christ figure with the Latin phrase, Clarior sole misere, you who are brighter than the sun, have mercy on us. And of course, his mother, Mary, Mater Salvatoris, mother of the Savior. So one question that archaeologists and historians have is, you know, how devout were these people, right? It's a question. Well, we think we have found some objects that suggest that some of them at least were quite serious. First off, we found this specimen, which looks like it's rather crudely made, probably locally, of some kind of trade silver perhaps. But it's been cut out in what's recognizably a Latin style cross. So the maker here could have cut out a diamond, a square, a star shape or circle, but they chose to cut out the shape of a cross. So there's some degree of intentionality there. And then it's amazing the detail on some of these objects. Here's the obverse and reverse of this cross, and it shows here the crucifixion scene. And then here, there's two cherubs here on these cross arms. And then this is a depiction of Mary and the earth with several celestial bodies, a crescent moon and so forth. This is depicting her ascension into heaven. So these were didactic objects. These are objects that were meant to teach the lessons of scriptural belief and so forth. And so that's suggests, again, the degree of devotion. And if that wasn't convincing, I'm hoping this might be. So we weren't quite sure what this was for a while, but we think we know what it is now. So I would describe it as a series of wires that are connected, and they're pointed on the end. You can see the point clearly here. The angle of the other doesn't allow you to see it. But we think this was part of a larger artifact that looked something like this. We think this is part of the Fort St. Joseph cilice. And a cilice is an object that would have been used to inflict a certain degree of pain, right? To emulate the suffering of Christ. So this one on the left is actually Bishop Scalabrini's cilice. He was a bishop in Toronto. and we're able to get a photograph of it. And then these on the right, 1, 2, 3, these are objects of flagellation here, but these, again, these are from 16th and 17th century Peru. And again, there's some variation, but they all share similarities in having these prongs that one could wrap around one's upper arm or thigh to produce, again, a sense of pain, right? To remind one of the suffering of Christ. And these are derived from, the term is derived from the hair shirts of the, they go back as early as the 3rd and 4th century AD, the goat hair shirts that people wore under their garments. It must have felt like wearing a burlap bag that just was always slightly uncomfortable, slightly or more so, uncomfortable, reminding people of the suffering of Christ. If you look at medieval imagery, paintings and so on, you'll often see beneath a very fancy outer garment, an inner garment that in fact looks like a cilice. Oh, by the way, the term comes from a place named Cilicia in Asia Minor, where these goats were raised and used in making these goat hair shirts. Okay, so some archaeological contributions here. I hope I showed you that archaeological discoveries provide evidence of daily life that went unrecorded in written documents. And by carefully studying the remains of the fur trade, we can learn about how people actually experience the fur trade, right? Not just prescriptive behaviors, right? Thimbles are used in sewing, but how they actually experienced the fur trade, how they modified those objects to use them in new and innovative ways. And our interpretations of the fur trade change as we collect more evidence and as we work with community groups who have an interest in our work. So I'm sort of near the end here, but I'm just going to wrap up by telling you a little bit about our partnerships and some of our upcoming work and so on. So lots and lots of people who have supported us here. And I've made mention of this before. But let me tell you about our ongoing work. So we hope to continue field work, public education, and public outreach. Right? COVID be damned, right? We want to now ensure the long-term curation of the collection. Right? So you work for 15 years at a site like Fort St. Joseph, and over that period of time, the notes, the samples, the artifacts, the specimens, all the recording and so on, we now have some 300,000 objects. Let me repeat, 300,000 objects recovered now from Fort St. Joseph, from tiny seed beads to big iron axes and everything in between. Right? So all this material has to be curated and preserved so that others can use it in the future. We're expanding our booklet series. We've published Women of New France and the Fur Trade and Sheltering New France, and now the one we're working on is called People of the Post. So keep your eye out for that. There'll be a digital version available on our website, and for you, it will be free for downloading. We hope to make the fort a heritage tourism destination, right? This is a place where people can come to learn about the fur trade, to learn about colonialism, to learn about Fort St. Joseph, and learn about how they can get involved. And our most recent publication for you more serious readers is the book Fort St. Joseph Revealed, University Press of Florida. As I like to say, everything we know about Fort St. Joseph. And that's what it looks like. Okay, so before we close out, let me end with this couple of slides here. So here's a very, very busy map, but you should recognize by now the Fort St. Joseph River, the St. Joseph River in the upper left-hand corner. And this green in the lower right-hand corner is the landfill, the dump. And all these little squares are places where we've excavated, and we've got fireplace, 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 fireplace that mark the locations of all those buildings. So again, as we started, some people said, oh, the river washed the site away. Others say it's under the landfill. And so we don't think the river washed that much of the site away. I could say more about that later. But we did wonder if maybe some of it could be beneath the landfill, just possibly. So here's where those buildings are, as I mentioned. And for the first time in 2019, we're able to access a backhoe. And we cut a series of trenches into this landfill. And then we put down a small core, and we actually found a couple of seed beads and a little bit of bone, some lead shot. It's like, oh, well, maybe there's something more here. So our hydrologist established a dewatering system to pump water out of the site so we can do dry site excavations. And we excavated in trench 1 and trench 2. We didn't get a chance to work in trench 3. We hadn't found quite as much material there. And surprise, surprise, here we are in the trench, students working in the trench. Look at how close they are to each other. And there's rusty metal sticking out of the sidewalls. And this was a very, very tedious enterprise, but we pulled it off. And what we're able to demonstrate through our excavations, that here's a piece of French faience, tin glazed earthenware made in France. Here's a knife blade from a knife made by a French cutler. Here's another piece of that copper alloy scrap that I talked about earlier. More beads of various sizes and colors. And this is a little ornament that someone probably dangled from their ear or their nose, right? Part of it is broken, but it's essentially like an ear bob or a nose bob. And a couple of white clay pipe stems from the 18th century. But most importantly, intact deposits, undisturbed archaeological materials in this trash deposit, in this midden. And you can see a student here very carefully brushing off the soil from this undisturbed deposit of 18th century material beneath the dump at Fort St. Joseph, effectively doubling the size of the archaeological site. And I'll leave it there and welcome your comments and questions.